Hello everyone, and welcome to the first of my general transfer tutorials applicable to the game of your choice, though I will be doing it in Kerbal Space Program, possibly even applicable to real life, though if you are doing it in real life, hopefully you've got more than this video to go on. So this is with an eye to the imminent public release of the pre-alpha of Kitten Space Agency, as well as the release of 1.0 for Re-Entry the Game. That is a game where you can simulate the Apollo spacecraft as well as Mercury and Gemini. We have here the Apollo spacecraft attached to its lunar transfer stage in Kerbal Space Program. But Re-Entry the Game is, of course, released already. It's just the fact that 1.0 is coming out on November 7th, so I decided that we should do something with that. Re-Entry itself would do a lot of the stuff automatically for you. Kitten Space Agency, right now the spacecraft has a great amount of delta V, which is the energy necessary to get places, so it's harder to do stuff in Kerbal Space Program right now than in those other games, but in Re-Entry, when it's doing its automated transfer burn, you might want to make sure that it's pointed in the right direction. Sometimes, if you've got something misaligned, it might not be pointing in the right direction when it tries to start to burn, and you should intervene because you possibly have gone through the checklist a little bit incorrectly, and let's see what exactly we should be looking for all that. So, we are going to be talking first about transferring to the moon, and the reason when we're going through all these transfer tutorials I start with going to the moon is because it's the easiest, actually. It's not the easiest in terms of technical capabilities, of course. It's the easiest in terms of explaining how to figure things out. When it comes to transferring to the moon, there are basically two flavors. There's the situation where you have launched properly and therefore you are in line with the moon. You can see our blue line orbit there is in line with the yellow orbit of the moon. So it's like that. And our relative inclination, how much tilt we have with respect to the moon, is very low. It's 1.12 degrees. It can be lower than that, but that's not unusual. So we don't have to correct that or do anything fancy. We are good to go as far as lining up with the moon. Do you have to line up with the moon in order to be able to transfer to the moon? No. That is not a requirement, and it's just going to cut down on the delta V necessary. It also cuts down on the amount of supplies you need. If you are not in line with the moon and you haven't timed it right, we would need more supplies to get there, and I'll explain exactly how that works out. So, if you are, regardless of what your situation is, whether you're in line with the moon or your orbit is tilted with respect to the moon, what you're going to be doing first is going in the direction of your current velocity. So you're not going to do anything else except for point in the direction of your current velocity, because any other kind of burn is not one that you want to do close to the Earth. The Earth favors you going in the direction of your current velocity or directly opposite that, but if you try to go out of plane, in other words, go off to the side one way or another, or tilt up or down with respect to your velocity vector, which is the yellow vector on our nav ball there, that would be bad. So, in Re-Entry or in any other game, what you're going to be looking for when it starts its burn is that you're pointed in the direction of motion, which means the ground and the clouds below you are going backwards, right? You can see the clouds are going directly backwards, and so then you can verify that you are pointing in the right direction. And that is the direction. Prograde, which is the direction of our velocity, is the direction that you want to be going in whenever you're trying to get to a higher orbit. So we're trying to get to a higher orbit. We're in this low orbit. We're going to a higher orbit like the moon. So we want to be going prograde. Now, what if you do have some inclination? Well, we'll fix that in one of two different ways. If it's really small, we can fix that on a mid-course correction. That means once we're on our way to the moon, having done the initial burn, we can fix the 1.12 degrees, and that's fine. If it's a lot, and I define a lot as 2 degrees or more, we would rather like to use the ascending or descending nodes. And those are the points where our orbit cross the moon's orbit. Now, it's not very apparent that that's where they cross, but let's change the situation. I'm going to use this cheat menu to change my orbit so it is tilted. And now we are tilted with respect to the moon at 22.68 degrees, and then it was trying to correct its orientation. But as you can see, if we make it so that our orbit and the moon's orbit are a single line, you can see how it's more of a single line instead of a double line, then this ascending node and that descending node are where the lines cross. Our orbit crosses the moon's orbit at those points. So if you're in a game where you cannot see an ascending or descending orbit node, there's no little marker there, that's fine. You can just eyeball it and see where the orbits cross. And then you have these two choices for when you can go to the moon. So if we were lined up, it's going to be different. But let me just tackle this problem first, because this is the more general situation. This is like, regardless of how you happen to have launched, you can still do this. So if you're not lined up with the moon, you have to judge based on the ascending and descending node. Right now, if we wanted to use this ascending node, and don't worry about the name right now, it's really close to the moon. The moon is still moving. The moon is always moving in its orbit, and it's actually going to pass this by the time we get there. If we were going to use a lot of energy to get there, if we had more than 3,236 meters per second, that's how much energy we have in this stage. If we're going to use a lot more thrust to get there, then we could maybe make it in time. On a normal transfer, it would eventually get up to about there. It's about 80 degrees that the moon covers, 75 to 80 degrees in the time of a normal transfer to the moon. It could be less. You could get there a little bit faster. And so you could get there in less than 4 days, maybe 3 days, something. And then the moon will have covered maybe 45, 50 degrees or something like that. So those are the ranges that we're talking about. Since neither of these nodes is like that, we're going to pick the one that is going to give us enough time. So the moon we're going to have to overshoot the moon so that we can meet up with it. So we are going to go out from the descending node, and we'll start at the descending node, but we're going to move it a little bit ahead, and I'll show you why that is in a moment. Always pulling on, in this case, we're pulling this prograde indicator. In other games, you might have to increase the prograde number some other way, like type it in or press a plus or something like that. The thing is, you're doing a burn in the prograde direction and only the prograde direction to meet up with it. And here, and reentry will have this too. You'll see the target position and the closest approach position, and you'll see this also in Kitten Space Agency and a bunch of other things. And what we're doing is we're going to move that and bring them together. In Kerbal Space Program, it's a little bit finicky, but here, let's get there, moon periapsis. So we're looking at the moon periapsis, and we see that we can get it pretty good. There it's 400. Okay. I think we're crashing into the moon there, so let's not do that. But here, I'm at 1 kilometer away from the moon there. So we can still get arbitrarily close to the moon. The problem is, we are going past the moon's orbit, and this is a slow part of our orbit, because the further away we get from the Earth, the slower we go. And so we end up going really slow out here, waiting for the moon to catch up. So if we wanted to do this well, we would want to try and aim for the moon here. And if you were fancy, even if you had to go to this inclined orbit for some reason or another, because you're going from the Soviet Union and launching out of Baikonur, and so you can't actually line up with the moon, the Soviet Union launch sites are at too high a latitude to actually cross the moon's orbit naturally. So since So for the Soviet Union, they would have to do this. Well, what they would do is instead of waiting this extra time hanging out there, which would be bad for the crew, they would launch on a day when the moon is closer to where that's going to be. So they would just wait. So they would only get 2 real opportunities per month, whereas from Cape Canaveral for NASA, they could relaunch on the next day, and then the next day. Basically, you have an opportunity every day if you want it. So, though there are other considerations aside from just making it there that they were interested in, like the lighting conditions at the location that they were landing. So, that's a whole complicated business that we don't have to talk about. But right now, we are getting there in 14 days, whereas the ideal sort of transfer would be 3 to 4 days. So that's taking too long, and in fact, it's more than our supplies would have time for. So the Kerbals, in this case, because of this Kerbal Space Program, or whatever astronauts you have, would perish, because that's taking too long to get there. So it would take some more planning, but if you were sending a probe, you could make it. And again, just because you didn't line up ahead of time, doesn't matter, you can get arbitrarily close to the moon. And in fact, in this case, pretty equatorial with the moon, which is special. And does it take that much more? Well, here, this off-plane transfer with this hanging out beyond the moon's orbit takes 3,161 meters per second. Going back to the situation where we are lined up with the moon, which is 28.6 degrees. So now we're nice and lined up, and we can aim for the moon. Let's just say that we're going to meet up with it 180 degrees ahead, which means our burn point is behind. Our burn point is going to be 100 degrees behind, because 100 plus 80 is 100 plus 80 is 180. Yeah. So taking where the moon is, drawing a line to the center of the Earth, and then drawing a line to our vessel. What we want is our vessel to be 100 degrees behind where the moon is. So that's not too different from where we are right now. This is just an estimate, by the way. Usually going to the moon is not so finicky that we need to be exact about the degrees behind it that we want to burn from. It's very easy to get to the moon. That's why we're starting on it. So here, we're starting our burn at a location that is 100 degrees behind the moon. I know it's a little bit hard to visualize it because the orbits are so different, but the moon is over there. We are over here. We could probably scooch it a little bit more this way. I'm trying to get that 100, but I don't have a protractor up to the screen or anything. One way we can tell is the amount of time it takes to get there. So what we want is we can adjust how long it takes to get to the moon by changing our burn location. I mean, that's what I said about the other side. Ultimately, if you burn from the opposite side, it's going to take a much longer time. But here, we are taking 4 days and 15 hours, and what we're optimizing for here is getting close with as little delta V as possible, with as little of our fuel as necessary. The previous one, going past the moon and taking 14 days, took 3,160 something. Here we're taking 3,127. And so this is pretty good. It could be better. If we want to go faster, we'll pull it in this direction. You can see the time to the moon going down. But then we're going to have to put potentially a little bit more, or we're going to end up going past, we're going to go further out from the moon. So since I don't want to go further out, part of that is because of our inclination, I'll take some extra time. This is not too bad here. The Apollo missions would have taken 3 days and 19 hours or something like that, but they started out with a particular inclination also in a particular situation in order to do that. So this is an okay transfer, but we could go faster. We actually entered the moon's sphere of influence in 4 days. So how do you plot this? Well, you just go prograde, right? Like I said, the vector is just going to be in our direction of motion. Even if you didn't have any way of plotting it, all you have to do is, here, I'm not even going to use SmartESS. We look at how the clouds are, and we turn the craft so that we are pointing in our direction of motion. That's it. So even if you had no information whatsoever except for the landscape below you, and then this map here, hopefully with the moon visible, the moon isn't quite visible there, you would say, okay, well, at a time about 100 degrees behind where the moon is, so the moon's there, draw a line to Earth, this is like 90 almost. It's almost a 90-degree angle, but 100 is only a little bit more than 90. And from this view, it's a little bit more apparent. That's a little bit more like 100. But from that location, as you can see this map, I'm going to not start. I'll have to start ahead of that because it's going to take some time to burn. So that's the midpoint of our burn. And we're going to start a little bit ahead of that. And a little bit ahead of that, we are going to be pointing in our direction of motion. So even if you didn't have a aligned nav ball, which is actually the main problem in re-entry, is making sure that your alignment is correct. Ignore the node down there. That's because we are not currently at the right timing. But we're going to point at the prograde vector, which hopefully your game of choice will have. It might look different from this one. So it's the yellow marker here. But you can just use the outside references. And then you have it hold steady, kill rotation or something like that. Each program has its own equivalent of kill rotation. That's a very standard function. Aside from just pointing prograde, hopefully whichever program you have is going to be able to just point prograde, but I'm just trying to do it manually here. And you can figure out exactly how early you should be burning compared to this midpoint of the burn. Normally, I like to think of it as doing 2/3 ahead. There's a definite calculation, but I'm not going to introduce the calculation here. Just as a basic rule, I want to do 2/3 of the time ahead of time and 1/3 after it. And the reason for that is because while we're still heavy, we're not going to get as much of the delta V done, not as much of the additional velocity done on the first bit. So we need about 2/3 of the time to do the first half of the delta V, and then about 1/3 of the time to do the other half. This is just an estimate. So if we've got basically a 6-minute burn time, we're going to do 4 minutes ahead and 2 minutes after. So from that node where we want to burn out of, we're going to be doing 4 minutes ahead. Here it's got almost like that. It's calculated something close to it, but it's more like 3.5 minutes ahead. I would do 4. And we're just going to go prograde. We're not going to follow that vector. 4 minutes ahead, if you had to eyeball it, a whole orbit like this is a little bit less than 90 minutes. So it's really only a small bit ahead of where the node is. If you could line it up exactly here, this is with the North Pole on top, and then you could get a protractor out. If it's a 90-minute thing, that's 4 degrees per minute, and so since it's 4 degrees per minute times 4 minutes, it's going to be 16 degrees ahead. So then, when the time comes, you can just ignite the engine. Make sure you're pointed flat and towards our direction of motion, and then that's that. And so even if you had no other reference, all you would do is wait until your orbit ends up touching the orbit of the moon. It's the truly lacking in reference version of things. Here I'm not pointing at the node, I'm just doing it this way, which is the rough way. Now, because I'm pointing directly prograde instead of following the node here, I have to be careful not to pay attention to this delta V ticker ticking down, because it's going to be inaccurate since it's expecting me to follow that blue marker for the plot that I made. But I'm trying to demonstrate that we should just go prograde. So Gonna go with that. It's simpler, it's effective, and it's generalizable, even if you don't have a maneuver node system to plot it ahead of time. So we are just going to see when our apoapsis comes into contact with the moon's orbit, and in this case we'll be able to see the periapsis and when that becomes really close to the moon. If you're dealing with a general system, in other words, not Earth and the moon situation where you're transferring out to some other moon, like, yeah, with the stock Kerbal moon, it's actually fairly similar to this, but with, let's say, Minmus in the stock system in Kerbal Space Program, or there's the Galileo system, or whatever system they end up having in Kitten Space Agency, we don't know what it'll be aside from our solar system. There is a calculation for when to start out. I'll link the details in the video description. There is a nice web page that goes over it. But just in case you don't want to do the calculation, the surefire way, if you will, is to first of all start 90 degrees behind the target and use a probe, not sending, you know, people on board or anything like that the first time, if you can avoid it. And with this probe, you're going to send it out starting 90 degrees behind, and then see when you reach there how far behind the moon is. So if the moon ends up 20 degrees, and you'll probably have to put like a protractor to the screen or something like that. If the moon is 20 degrees behind when you reach the moon's orbit, keep in mind that you should make sure that your high point on your orbit is just touching the moon's orbit. Then if the moon is 20 degrees behind, you make sure to increase the amount of degrees by 20 degrees. So then you'll go to 110 degrees beforehand. So if you do 110 degrees beforehand, it'll move your encounter point this way to adjust for the fact that the moon is behind. So if you start out 90 degrees behind the moon, you're going to end up 90 degrees ahead of where the moon was when you started. If you start out 110 degrees behind the moon, you're going to end up 70 degrees ahead of the moon wherever the moon was when you started. So it's like that. So it's however many degrees it is, you move your start back by that amount if the moon was behind. If the moon is ahead, you move your maneuver ahead. So you can see right now, if we were going with this delta V here, we wouldn't have enough, but actually we do. There is a peculiar thing where we seem to have surplus oxygen, so things are not quite right here. This craft file that I used might be outdated. Realism Overhaul, which modifies the parts to make them like real parts, has changed since this particular craft file was put together, so I picked an old one. But I went too far. So okay, but it's fine. We're meeting up with it a little bit early, and I overburned a bit because I was talking about that stuff. So, well, if we wanted to, we could go retrograde and use the little APS packs to adjust this. This, at this point, does not have any more ignitions. I mean, it normally would have. I think I've just got the wrong configuration for it. It would still have one more. So, if we've gone too far, of course, we point retrograde, and then we can correct that. Not the J2. Here, let me shut that down so that it uses those. Oh, I guess we could use these little boosters. I never did use those. That had some effect. Okay, there's the APS packs. I'm not going to do the whole transposition and docking with the Apollo spacecraft and the lunar module. We'll just take the Apollo spacecraft out to the moon. Having this inclination was deliberate. I want to show a midcourse correction, and I'll even have this a little bit further out to make the correction even more important. Okay, so let's say we've got that, and we definitely need a midcourse correction like that. For now, though, we'll separate from the rest of this, so those panels come off a little bit weird. I've got to unlock these fuels and activate the RCS. And we're free. Again, I'm not going to bother with the Lunar module for now. Right. So we can actually do even a little bit more to get closer. So we're going to do a mid-course correction, and as indicated, it's directly in the middle. And the reason for that is we might be doing a little bit of the prograde and retrograde, we might be doing a little bit of the other directions. If we only wanted to do prograde or retrograde, it would be better to do it closer to Earth, or really close to the moon. But by that time, we'd want to be well settled and approaching exactly the way we want to. We just want to be close to some gravitating body. But if we're doing the other directions, either radial or normal, then we want to do it away from the Earth because those cost more. So I'm doing it here in the middle. And first of all, I'm pulling up here. Now, obviously we are going south here, and if we want to be equatorial, we have to pull north. And so you'll note that the direction of the node is actually north. So if you don't have any other reference, what you would want to do is point, take a look at the Earth and sort of orient yourself so that you're pointing north with respect to the Earth. And then you will pull your orbit up. And then, of course, you could do the reverse. You can go south if you need to pull your orbit down. But what you'll notice is we're crashing into the moon. So we need to reduce how much we're adding into the orbit. And we could go the other way around the moon. Technically, Apollo went the other way around. So we could increase how much energy we are putting into the orbit to make sure that we're going around the way they did, which is actually backwards or retrograde. So if I wanted to do that, I increase how much energy by going prograde, and then I'm going retrograde around the moon, this way around, clockwise. The normal way, I say normal, but the way Apollo did it was retrograde, which is clockwise. The normal way, prograde around the moon, would be counterclockwise, so this way around. And this way around takes a little bit less, but once you do capture, it hardly matters, really. And actually, in this case, it costs less to go this way around because we are already going this way around. You can sort of see our orbit was coming in this way and going out that way, so we were already retrograde. So, what this mostly is still pointing north and correcting the inclination. That's mostly what we're doing in order to get a equatorial orbit, but we could just keep with a polar orbit if we wanted to, if that was our goal. And then it's leaning a little bit prograde. You see it a little bit prograde there in order to make sure we're not crashing into the moon. We're going one way or another around it. That part can actually be corrected once we're there. So what I'm going to do is just do the normal one, because you could probably eyeball it like that. So all we're going to be doing is we're going to be crashing into the moon. And then we'll fix the other part once we get there. So I happen to know, because this is an old model, it's not going to like the engine. So if I look at the engine, it says needs high pressure tanks, and that's because it doesn't have helium in. So I'm just going to do the burn with the RCS here. In a fit of enthusiasm, I started this burn a little bit early. There is a mathematical proof out there that you really want to do these adjustments mid-course rather than higher up or closer. Definitely not closer, because we all know that closer into a gravitating body, you don't want to do a normal burn like this. But it is the case that you want to be mid-course. I cannot replicate that particular proof, but it exists. Okay, this is probably good enough. Alright, so now we're smacking into the moon. We wouldn't want to be doing this, but it's to demonstrate that once we get into lunar SOI, we can adjust this. The general goal is to get as close as possible to the moon initially. And there are many adjustments that need to be made, potentially, but what we're going to do is, the rule that we're going to say is, your first burn is going to be prograde, and that's the one that's close to the Earth. Mid-course, you're going to do one that's normal, which means north or south. And then once you get into lunar SOI, you're going to do one that's radial. And that means pulling it closer into the moon or pulling it away from the moon. Even once we are in lunar sphere of influence, it's still pretty far from the actual moon. There's a lot of distance. So it's okay to do a radial burn from it. That's the moon. Okay, so we're 64,000 kilometers up, which is pretty high up from the moon. And let's say you were doing this without any reference, except for knowing that you're crashing into the moon. Hopefully you will have your periapsis. These blue markers are the radial ones. And so initially we were pointing at the yellow markers. Mid-course we were using the pink markers or purple markers, and then we're using the blue ones. And then you would just give a puff and see whether it was going to be bringing you in the right direction. Right now we're crashing, it's a negative periapsis, we want a positive one, and this is making our periapsis more positive, so that this is the right way to correct. Now, if you're a pro at this, you'll probably do this at the mid-course correction as it is. But worst case scenario, you can do it here. So ideally, you would just do it in a mid-course correction, and it'll probably cost less. How much is it going to cost here? Well, let's actually plot it here. We want a periapsis of about 100 kilometers. 90 kilometers is fine. So it's taking 17.1 meters per second. It's not too bad. But really, it's right when you enter lunar SOI that you want to do this. If you can correct it earlier, great. And you should be able to do that by plotting at a mid-course correction instead. And you would still, you could be using the prograde retrograde there, because when you're out here, when you're along the way, prograde and retrograde can have the effect of radial. Radial is only once you're in lunar SOI, the directionality of everything sort of changes. So you'll have to play around whether it's prograde, retrograde, or radial out there that's more efficient at correcting your orbit. The one thing you definitely want to do out there is the normal part. I use these terms normal. Some other programs might call something else normal. Normal actually just means at a 90-degree angle. At a 90-degree angle, in particular from prograde. So either what we call radial in Kerbal Space Program, what we call radial in Kerbal Space Program could also be called normal, because normal just means at a 90-degree angle. So you have to be careful about that one. They can have different names. Prograde and retrograde won't have a different name, but what we call normal and radial in Kerbal Space Program might. The closer into the moon you try to do this correction, the worse it's going to get. The closer into the moon you try to do a normal burn, the worse that's going to get. Anyway, this was a demonstration. I think I've covered what I wanted to cover, even though they're going to perish one way or another. So don't worry about that. That's beside the point. Sometimes in the course of doing demonstrations, things happen. But yeah, this was not a particularly good craft file to use, but I wanted to use Apollo because it's the one spacecraft that we have in Kerbal, in Reentry, and in Kitten Space Agency right now. There's also Gemini in all three. But yeah, this particular one turns out to be a dud. So I'll have to make sure to delete it and find the more updated one. But anyway, that covers the tutorial bit, despite the foibles. And with that, I'll say thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do press like. If you have any comments or suggestions, please leave them in the comment section below, and I'll see you next time.